The invitation lay on the kitchen table, its elegant cursive letters catching the faint morning light as it filtered through the curtains. It was a beautiful thing, handcrafted with care, adorned with gold trimming. But the mother staring at it barely noticed the details. Her eyes were locked on the name. His name, that it had been years, so many years since she had last spoken to her son. She tried to remember the sound of his voice, but it felt distant, almost like an old melody she could no longer hum with confidence. Still, she knew it by heart once, as surely as she knew the rhythm of his breathing when he was a child, asleep in her arms. How had things come to this? Her heart ached with the weight of memories, of a bond that once seemed unbreakable. This was not how she had imagined her life would unfold. Once upon a time, she had cradled him in her arms, fresh into the world, believing with all her soul that no force could ever separate them. He was her son, her joy, the center of her universe, as a young mother. She poured every ounce of love she had into raising him. Her life became a symphony of lullabies, scraped knees, school lunches, and bedtime stories. She could still see the spark in his eyes when he learned something new, the way his face would light up when he conquered a fear, or how his small hand would cling to hers when he was uncertain. But it wasn't all sweetness, was it? Life had its challenges, and being a single mother came with a heavy set of burdens. She had fought for him, fought against the world and against herself at times, struggling to provide, to nurture, to be everything he needed. Sometimes she stumbled. There were nights when the exhaustion overwhelmed her, when the weight of unpaid bills and the strain of making ends meet left her raw and sharp. She regretted those moments more than anything. There were times when she had snapped at him, times when she wasn't as patient as she wanted to be. But she always apologized, didn't she? She always tried to make it right. At least, that's what she told herself. She had loved him so fiercely, so deeply, that she had thought nothing could break the bond between them. It was love, after all, and love was enough, that or so she had believed. The years had passed in a blur, and she watched him grow from a boy into a young man. He had dreams, ambitions, and like any mother, she encouraged them. She wanted him to fly, to reach for the stars, to chase after his passions without fear. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. It wasn't sudden, not really. It was more like a gradual drift, like two boats that had once sailed together but were now quietly drifting apart without either realizing how far the distance between them had grown. She could trace back the first signs of it, though it hurt to admit it. It was in his teenage years when the rebellion started. It was typical, she knew, for children to pull away during adolescence. They needed space to define themselves, to separate from the safety of home, so they could learn to stand on their own. She had expected that. But it wasn't just the normal teenage angst, was it? No, this was different. It was the look in his eyes, something deeper, darker. A distance that wasn't just physical, but emotional. A wall being built brick by brick between them. At first, she had tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just a phase, something he would grow out of. But the wall only grew taller as he started coming home less, spending more time with friends she didn't know, in places she had never been. He grew secretive, evasive. When she asked him questions, he would snap at her, his tone sharp, accusing. The words he threw at her cut deep, but she tried not to let him see how much they hurt. She was his mother. She had to be strong, had to keep her composure. But inside, she was crumbling. And then, one day, he was gone. There had been no warning, no final argument, no dramatic confrontation. He simply left. She came home from work to find his room empty, his things packed. There was no note, no explanation, just silence. She had stood in the doorway of his room for what felt like hours, unable to comprehend what had happened. The bed, stripped of its sheets, looked foreign, like it belonged to a stranger, not the boy she had raised. The walls, once plastered with posters and pictures, were bare. Everything that had made the room his was gone. Just like him, in the days that followed, she searched for answers. She called his friends, his teachers, anyone who might know where he had gone, but no one had any answers. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Her heart was shattered, but still, she held on to hope. He would come back. He had to. This was just a phase, a moment of rebellion. He was young, impulsive. He would realize his mistake and return. And when he did, she would be there, ready to welcome him with open arms. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The phone never rang. The door never opened. He never came back. She had tried to move on, to live her life without him, but it was impossible. Every corner of the house reminded her of him. The sound of children laughing on the street outside would send a pang through her chest, reminding her of the laughter that had once filled her home. She had stopped going to the places they used to visit together, unable to bear the memories that clung to every corner. People told her to let go, to move on, but how could she? He was her son. A mother doesn't simply stop loving her child. She couldn't erase him from her heart, no matter how hard she tried. The pain of his absence became a constant companion, a dull ache that never truly went away. And then, after all these years, this invitation had arrived that IT had come in the mail with no prior warning, no letter or phone call to prepare her. She had nearly thrown it away, assuming it was just another piece of junk mail, until she saw the name on the return address. His name. Her hands had trembled as she opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. The words inside were simple, formal. He was getting married. She was invited that IT should have been a moment of joy. After all these years, he was reaching out to her, inviting her to share in one of the most important days of his life. But all she could feel was confusion, and beneath that, an overwhelming sense of dread. Why now? Why after so many years of silence? What did this mean? Did he truly want her there? Or was this some kind of cruel formality, an obligation he felt he had to fulfill? The question swirled in her mind, unanswered. Her hand hovered over the invitation now, as if by touching it, she could somehow decipher the true meaning behind it. Did he miss her? Was this his way of extending an olive branch, of saying he was sorry without actually using the words? Or was it something else, something she couldn't yet understand? As she stood there, her heart in turmoil, she couldn't shake the feeling that this invitation was more than just a simple gesture. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't quite put her finger on, something that could either heal the wounds of the past or rip them open even wider. And that terrified her. She had waited for so long, hoping for a day like this, a day when her son would come back into her life. But now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. What if the distance between them was too great to bridge? What if seeing him again only deepened the pain she had tried so hard to bury? But despite all her fears, one thing was certain. She had to go. She had to see him. She had to know why. After all this time, he had finally reached out. With a deep breath, she picked up the invitation, clutching it tightly in her hand. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of the story. The rift began as something small, almost imperceptible. At the time, she thought it was just a phase, one of those natural transitions every mother-child relationship goes through. But looking back, she could see how it had been the start of something much larger, much more damaging than she ever imagined. The little cracks that started to show weren't just part of the growing pains of adolescence. They were the first signs of an emotional fracture that would eventually tear them apart. In the beginning, it was just the small things. He started spending more time in his room, closed off from her and the rest of the world. His bedroom door, once left ajar, now remained shut most of the time. The conversations between them, once filled with the light-hearted banter of a boy who still sought his mother's approval, became terse, almost businesslike. How was school? Fine. Did you do your homework? Yeah. Anything interesting happen today? Not really. And that was it. Each exchange shorter than the last. Each word clipped as if to keep her at arm's length. She told herself it was normal. Teenagers needed space to grow. They needed privacy, the freedom to assert their independence. She had been the same way at his age, hadn't she? So, she let it go. She didn't want to be the overbearing mother who stifled her son's sense of self. She wanted him to feel like he could come to her on his own terms, in his own time. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that time never came. The distance between them grew wider, a chasm slowly forming, and she found herself standing on one side of it, helpless as he drifted further and further away from her. The phone call started shortly after that. At first, they were infrequent, just a few here and there, usually with friends whose names she barely recognized. But soon, it seemed like his phone was glued to his hand. He was always texting, always distracted by the screen, his attention elsewhere even when he was physically present. She didn't pry. She trusted him. Or at least, she wanted it. It wasn't until she overheard one of his conversations late one night that she felt the first true twinge of fear. It was well past midnight, and she had woken up to the sound of his voice, hushed but intense, filtering through the walls. She crept down the hallway, her bare feet soft on the carpet, and stood just outside his door. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but something in his tone had unnerved her. "Yeah, I told her I'd be there." No, she has no idea. It's not like she cares anyway. The words hit her like a slap. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out the rest of the conversation, but that single sentence played over and over in her mind. It's not like she cares anyway. Was he talking about her? Did he really believe that she didn't care? The thought was devastating. How could he not see how much she cared? How deeply she loved him? Everything she did, every sacrifice she made, was for him. She had given him her whole heart, her whole life. But there was more to it, wasn't there? A deeper current running beneath the surface, one that she hadn't fully acknowledged before. It wasn't just that he believed she didn't care. It was that in some way, he was pushing her away. There was something going on, something he wasn't telling her. And instead of confiding in her, he had decided to shut her out entirely. She confronted him the next morning, trying to sound casual, not wanting to come off as accusatory. But the conversation didn't go the way she had hoped. "You were up late last night," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee at the kitchen counter. "I heard you talking on the phone." His eyes flicked toward her, then back to the bowl of cereal in front of him. "Yes, so? I just wanted to make sure everything's okay," she said, carefully choosing her words. "You know you can talk to me, right?" He shrugged. "There's nothing to talk about." She tried to keep her tone light, but the worry was creeping into her voice. "It sounded like you were upset." "I'm fine, Mom." His voice was flat, dismissive. "It's not a big deal." That was how it always went with him now. Every time she tried to dig deeper, to figure out what was going on in his life, he shut her down. The walls between them kept growing taller, thicker, until she felt like she was shouting across a canyon. And he was standing on the other side, refusing to listen. The argument started soon after that. It was never about anything big, not at first. Just the usual teenage defiance, missing curfew, not doing his chores, that sort of thing. But what had once been minor disagreements between them escalated into full-blown confrontations. He became hostile, quick to anger, lashing out at her with words that left invisible scars. "Why do you always have to control everything?" he would yell, his face twisted in frustration. "I'm not a little kid anymore. I don't need you telling me what to do all the time." "I'm not trying to control you," she would respond, her voice rising with her own frustration. "I just want to make sure you're making good choices." "Well, maybe I don't need you making my choices for me." She would stand there, speechless, feeling the sting of his words like a physical blow. How had things gotten so bad between them? When had he become so angry, so resentful? She felt like she was losing him, but no matter what she did, she couldn't seem to stop it. The breaking point came one night during his senior year of high school. It had been a particularly rough few weeks. He had been staying out late, coming home at all hours, his behavior more erratic than ever. She had tried talking to him, but every conversation ended in a shouting match. The tension in the house was unbearable, like walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next explosion would come. That night, she had waited up for him, pacing the living room, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. It was nearly 2 a.m. when she heard the front door creak open. He slipped inside, tried to be quiet, but she was already there, standing in the dim light of the hallway. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice tight with worry and anger. He froze, his eyes wide for a moment before narrowing in irritation. "Out! Out where?" "Just out, okay?" he snapped, brushing past her. "No, it's not okay," she shouted, following him down the hallway. "You can't just disappear all night without telling me where you are." "I'm not a kid, Mom," he shouted back, turning to face her. "I don't have to report to you every time I leave the house." "Yes, you do. As long as you're living under my roof, you have to follow my rules." Maybe I don't want to live under your roof anymore." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. She felt her heart drop, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't move. All she could do was stare at him, her mind racing to process what he had just said. "Are you saying you want to leave?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but he didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked away from hers, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his expression. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold anger that had been simmering between them for months. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "Maybe I am." She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to beg him not to go, to remind him of everything they had been through together, everything she had sacrificed for him. But another part of her, a quieter, more desperate part, knew that if she pushed him any harder, he would only pull further away, so she stood there, silent and helpless, watching as he stormed down the hallway and slammed the door to his bedroom behind him. That night, she barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this really happening? Was she about to lose him for good? She had always believed that no matter how far he drifted, no matter how much they argued, he would eventually come back to her. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The next morning, he was gone. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't leave a note. He just left. She found his room empty, his clothes and belongings packed up, the bed neatly made as if he had never lived there at all. The silence that followed was deafening, did I end the days and weeks that followed. She tried to contact him, but every attempt was met with silence. She called his phone, left messages, sent texts, nothing. It was as if he had vanished, cut her out of his life completely. She reached out to his friends, hoping they might know where he had gone, but no one seemed to have any answers. The ache in her chest grew heavier with each passing day, a constant, gnawing pain that wouldn't go away. She had always feared that something like this might happen, but she had never truly believed it would. How could it? He was her son. No matter how far he drifted, no matter how much they fought, she had always believed that their bond was unbreakable. But now, standing in his empty room, she wasn't so sure anymore. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. She went through the motions of her life, but everything felt hollow, like she was just going through the motions without truly living. The house felt empty without him, the silence suffocating. Every time the phone rang, her heart would leap in her chest, hoping it was him, only to feel the crushing disappointment when it wasn't. She replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, wondering where she had gone wrong. What could she have done differently? Should she have been more patient, more understanding? Or had she been too lenient, too forgiving of his behavior? The questions tormented her, but she had no answers. Time passed, but the pain didn't lessen. If anything, it grew sharper, a constant reminder of what she had lost. She had always thought that a mother's love was enough to hold her family together, that no matter what, love would prevail. But now, she wasn't so sure. There were moments when she found herself standing at his bedroom door, her hand resting on the doorknob, as if opening it would somehow bring him back. But every time she opened the door, the room was just as she had left it, empty, lifeless, a reminder of the void he had left behind. And then one day, without warning, the phone finally rang. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, just before sunset, slipping through the slot in her door with the rest of the mail. At first, she didn't notice it, buried beneath the usual stack of bills, advertisements, and coupons she would never use. She hadn't been expecting anything out of the ordinary. Why would she? Her days had long since fallen into a rhythm of predictable monotony, each one passing much like the last, defined by silence and solitude. It wasn't until she was sitting at the kitchen table, absently sorting through the pile, that the envelope caught her eye. Thick, cream-colored paper, her name written in a careful, deliberate hand. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but there was something about the way her name had been written, something formal, almost distant, that made her pause. She set aside the stack of overdue bills and held the envelope up to the light, as if expecting it to reveal something of its contents through the opaque paper. Her thumb traced the edges of the envelope, her heart picking up a beat, though she wasn't sure why. There was nothing particularly ominous about it, nothing that should have caused the slight flutter of anxiety that began to build in her chest. But it was there all the same, some small voice in the back of her mind whispering that whatever this was, it was important. With careful fingers, she tore open the seal and pulled out the contents. Inside was a single card, beautifully designed, with delicate gold embossing around the edges. The words were simple, elegant. It was an invitation to a wedding. His wedding. Her son's wedding. For a moment, the world around her seemed to still, the air thickening as the words on the card blurred in front of her eyes. She blinked, reading and rereading the names printed at the top, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake. Someone else's invitation delivered to her by accident. That was the only explanation that made sense. But her name was there too, in the same careful handwriting. She was invited to his wedding. She set the card down on the table, her hands suddenly trembling. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, her chest tight with the weight of 1,000 emotions crashing down on her all at once. Confusion, disbelief, anger, sadness, hope. She didn't know which one to focus on first. She hadn't seen or heard from her son in years. Not since the day he left, slamming the door behind him and taking with him the last shred of connection they had once shared. She had waited, of course, waited for the phone to ring, for the sound of his footsteps returning to the front door. But the days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. Silence had been her only companion. She had tried to reach out time and time again. She left voicemails, sent texts, even wrote letters. But there had never been a response. It was as if he had vanished, leaving her behind without a second thought. She had no idea where he was, what he was doing, or how he was living his life. All she had were the ghosts of the memories they had once shared, memories that now felt as distant as another lifetime. And now, after all this time, this invitation had arrived. Out of the blue, with no warning, no explanation. An invitation to a wedding she hadn't even known was happening. Her son was getting married, and she had learned about it in the same way one might hear about a stranger's celebration. A piece of mail, impersonal and detached, a formality. Why? Why now? Why, after all these years, was he suddenly reaching out to her? What had changed? Did he even want her there? Or was this just an obligation, something he felt he had to do out of some misplaced sense of duty? The questions swirled in her mind, each one heavier than the last, but none of them had answers. She stood up from the table, her legs unsteady, and walked to the window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a deep orange glow over the street outside. She watched the shadows lengthen, the light fading, and for a moment, she allowed herself to remember. Her son had been her whole world once. From the moment he was born, he had become the axis around which her life revolved. She had raised him on her own, doing the best she could with what little they had. It hadn't been easy, but she had never complained. Every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every sacrifice she made, it had all been worth it because it was for him. He was her purpose, her reason for everything. A child. He had been sweet, thoughtful, always wanting to help her with even the smallest of tasks. He had a laugh that could light up a room and a curiosity that seemed boundless. She had loved watching him grow, seeing the world through his eyes, full of wonder and possibility. She had believed, with all her heart, that they would always be close, that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. But somewhere along the way, that had changed. The boy she had known had slipped away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. The rift between them had grown slowly at first, the result of typical teenage rebellion, or so she had thought. But the distance only widened as he got older, until it felt as though there was a wall between them, impenetrable and cold. She had tried to reach him, tried to break through that wall, but every attempt had been met with resistance. He had become secretive, withdrawn, keeping parts of his life hidden from her. And then one day, he was gone. Just gone. In the years that followed, she had replayed their last conversation over and over again in her mind, searching for the moment when it all went wrong. What had she said? What had she done to push him away? Had she been too controlling? Too demanding? Or had she simply not been enough? The questions plagued her, haunting her in the quiet moments of the night when there was nothing to distract her from the gnawing ache of his absence. She had imagined countless scenarios in which he might return. Perhaps he would show up at her door one day, full of apologies, ready to rebuild the relationship they had lost. Or maybe she would run into him by chance somewhere, and the sight of each other would bring everything rushing back, all the love, all the forgiveness. But never had she imagined that the first contact she would have from him after all this time would be a wedding invitation. She turned away from the window, her gaze drifting back to the card on the table. The words stared back at her, taunting her with their simplicity. "You are cordially invited." What did it mean? Why had he sent this? Did he truly want her there? Or was this just a perfunctory gesture, something he felt obligated to do, but didn't actually mean? Was there a chance, however small, that this was his way of reaching out, of trying to mend the broken pieces of their relationship? Or was it just another reminder of how far apart they had grown, of how little she knew about the man he had become? Her mind raced with the possibilities, each one more confusing than the last. She needed answers, but she had no way of getting them. She could call him, of course. His number hadn't changed as far as she knew. But would he even pick up? Would he even want to talk to her? Or would he let the phone ring and ring, just as he had so many times before? She imagined what it would be like to see him again after all these years. The last time she had seen him, he had been little more than a boy, full of anger and resentment, his words sharp and cruel. But now he was a man about to be married. What did he look like now? Had he changed? Would she even recognize him? And more importantly, would he recognize her? She glanced at the mirror hanging on the wall, catching a glimpse of her own reflection. The years had taken their toll on her. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, her hair streaked with gray. She looked older, more tired than she remembered. Would he even see the mother he once knew, or just a stranger who had been left behind in his past? She sank into a chair, her hands resting on the table, her mind swirling with doubt. She had no idea what to do. Should she go? Should she try to bridge the gap between them? To reach out one more time, in the hopes that there was still something left to salvage? Or should she stay away, accept that whatever they once had was gone, and that this invitation was nothing more than a polite formality, devoid of any real meaning? The thought of attending his wedding filled her with equal parts hope and dread. What would it be like, standing in the back of the room, watching as he pledged his life to someone else, a woman she had never met, who knew nothing of the boy he had once been? Would she feel like an outsider, intruding on a moment that wasn't hers to share? Or would there be a part of her that felt like she still belonged, like there was still a place for her in his life? She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. There were too many unknowns, too many unanswered questions. And yet, despite everything, a part of her still wanted to go. A part of her still longed for the chance to see him, to speak to him, to hear his voice again, to find out, once and for all, if there was still a connection between them, buried somewhere beneath the years of silence and distance. But the fear was there too. The fear that she would arrive, only to find that she was nothing more than a guest, a name on a list, someone who had been invited out of obligation, not love. The fear that he wouldn't look at her the way he used to, with that spark of recognition and affection, but instead with the cold, distant gaze of a stranger. She couldn't bear the thought of that. Couldn't bear the thought of standing there, in the midst of his new life, and realizing that she no longer had a place in it. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She had spent so many years waiting, hoping, praying for some kind of sign that he still cared, that he still thought of her. And now here it was in the form of a simple card, an invitation. But was it enough? She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the card, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of it all. As she stood in front of the mirror, the invitation still in her hand, she wondered if she had the strength to face what lay ahead. The wedding was tomorrow. It was set to take place in a sprawling garden just outside the city, a venue she had only seen in pictures online after hours of staring at the invitation, unsure whether to RSVP or let it drift away like all the other milestones she'd missed in her son's life. She had lost count of the sleepless nights that had passed since she received that invitation, nights where she'd tossed and turned, torn between the unbearable hope that seeing him again would lead to reconciliation and the gnawing dread that it was too late. Years had gone by, and those years had carved a canyon between them. A canyon too deep, perhaps, for even the bridge of motherhood to cross. Her son's face flashed in her mind. She could still remember it as if it were yesterday. The way he had looked at her the last time they spoke, his eyes filled with hurt and anger, words so sharp and bitter that they had cut her to the core. She had told herself it was just a phase, that they would make up, that he would come home and things would go back to the way they were. But they never had. Instead, the silence had grown. Every unanswered phone call, every ignored message had chipped away at her until she had stopped reaching out altogether. And now, suddenly, this wedding. The invitation had felt like a door opening, but also a test. Had he sent it out of obligation? A social courtesy he couldn't avoid? Or was this his way of offering an olive branch, of inviting her back into his life? The not knowing was the worst part. Her eyes scanned her reflection in the mirror. She hardly recognized herself anymore. There were new lines on her face, more gray in her hair. She looked tired, not just from the years, but from the constant weight of what she had lost. And yet, here she was, trying to decide what to wear to a wedding that she wasn't even sure she was welcome at. She had almost convinced herself not to go. The fear of rejection, of showing up and realizing she was just another guest in his new life, had been overwhelming. But something inside her, some small ember of hope, had refused to let her stay away. She had gone out and bought a dress. Nothing too fancy, but nice enough to show that she had made an effort. She had told herself that no matter what happened, she needed to be there. She needed to see him, even if only from a distance. The morning of the wedding arrived with a heavy sky, the kind of thick, overcast gray that seemed to mirror the uncertainty she felt in her heart. She dressed slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she zipped up her dress and slipped on her shoes. She had been practicing what she would say if she saw him, going over the words in her mind like some kind of rehearsed script. But now, as the reality of the day set in, she wasn't sure any words would come at all. The drive to the venue was longer than she had expected, the city gradually giving way to rolling hills and sprawling estates. The GPS guided her down narrow roads lined with towering trees, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. She felt like she was being swallowed by the landscape, as if the world itself were trying to pull her deeper into the unknown. When she finally arrived, she hesitated for a long moment in the parking lot. Other guests were already making their way toward the garden, dressed in elegant attire, chatting and laughing as they walked in groups. She watched them from behind the safety of her windshield, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. She stepped out of the car, smoothing down her dress as she made her way to the entrance. The garden was breathtaking, just as the pictures had shown. Rows of neatly manicured hedges, flower beds bursting with color, and a grand gazebo at the center where the ceremony would take place. Everything looked perfect, as if it had been plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. But the beauty of the place only made her feel more out of place. She scanned the crowd, looking for a familiar face, but saw none. It was strange, being here among these strangers who were celebrating her son's happiness, while she felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. She took a seat near the back, her heart sinking as she realized just how far away she felt, not only physically, but emotionally. The guests around her were talking and laughing, caught up in the joy of the day, while she sat in silence, waiting for the moment when she might catch a glimpse of him. Would he look different? Would he even notice her? The music started, and she turned her attention to the front of the garden. The bride was walking down the aisle, a vision in white, her veil flowing behind her like a cloud. The guests all rose to their feet, but she stayed seated, her eyes locked on the groom. There he was. Her son, that he looked older, of course, more mature, but there was no mistaking him. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched him, standing there, waiting for his bride. The boy she had raised was now a man, and she didn't even know him anymore as the ceremony unfolded. She found herself drifting in and out of the words being spoken, her mind too consumed by the flood of emotions to focus on the vows or the exchange of rings. This moment should have been filled with joy, But all she could feel was the weight of everything that had been lost between them. And then, just as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, something unexpected happened. Her son looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd, and for a brief, fleeting moment, his gaze landed on her. She held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she was sure he could hear it from across the garden. Their eyes locked, and time seemed to slow, the noise of the crowd fading into the background as everything narrowed down to just the two of them. In that split second, she saw something in his eyes. Recognition, yes, but also something else. Was it regret? Pain? A flicker of the boy he had once been, before the anger and the distance. But just as quickly as it had come, the moment was gone. His gaze shifted, turning back to his new wife, and the world rushed back in. The crowd erupted in applause as the newlyweds kissed, sealing their union. And she felt herself slipping back into the shadows, forgotten once again. The reception was held in a large, open-air tent at the far end of the garden. By the time she made her way there, the celebration was in full swing. Guests were dancing, laughing, toasting to the happy couple. She hovered near the edges of the party, unsure of where to go or what to do. She felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. But then, in the midst of the laughter and music, she spotted him again. He was standing near the head table, his arm around his bride, smiling at something one of the guests had said. He looked happy, truly happy. It was a sight she hadn't seen in years. Her chest tightened. This was what she had wanted for him, wasn't it? For him to find happiness, to build a life filled with love and joy. And yet, seeing him like this, surrounded by people she didn't know, people who had taken her place in his life, filled her with a deep, aching sadness. She had missed so much, too much. She was about to turn and leave when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Mom. The word hit her like a lightning bolt. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. That it was him. Her son, he was standing there, right in front of her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Regret? Relief? She couldn't tell. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, looking at each other, the weight of all the years between them hanging heavy in the air. I didn't think you'd come, he said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. I almost didn't. There was a silence that followed, thick and uncomfortable. The noise of the party seemed distant now, as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving just the two of them in this moment. I didn't know if you wanted me here, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of all the unspoken words. His eyes flickered with something, an emotion she couldn't place, but he didn't look away. I wasn't sure either, he admitted, but I sent the invitation because, I don't know, maybe I thought it was time. Time for what? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Time to stop pretending like none of it mattered, like you didn't matter. Her heart skipped a beat at his words. She had spent so many years believing that she no longer held any place in his life, that he had moved on without her. But hearing him say that, hearing him acknowledge that she still mattered, even after everything, was more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. I didn't know how to reach you, she said softly. I didn't know if you even wanted me to. He looked down at the ground for a moment, his jaw tight, as if he were struggling with something deep inside. I was angry, he said finally. Angry at a lot of things. But that doesn't mean I didn't want you in my life. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the years of silence and pain. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time in years, she saw something familiar there, something warm, something she had thought was lost forever. I know, he said quietly. Me too. And just like that, the years of hurt and distance seemed to dissolve, leaving only the fragile hope of what might come next.